and I also direct the Artists in Residence program. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce our visiting critic, Anna Katz. Anna's been conducting virtual studio visits with our current Artists in Residence this week. We're really lucky to have her. And she's going to be giving a lecture today. Before we begin, please know that the lecture will be followed by a Q&A period. And please type your questions into the Q&A box at the lower right hand of your Zoom screen. So you can take a look, move your cursor and look down. It's the far right at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can type in a question at any time. I'm the only one that sees them, so you can type them out throughout the talk as well. And then I will pose them to Anna when she is done. So please don't be shy and ask away. And so Anna Katz is curator at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles. Recent exhibitions at MoCA include With Pleasure, Pattern and Decoration in American Art, 1972 to 1985, Give and Take, highlighting recent acquisitions, and Peter Shire, Naked is the Best Disguise. Previously a Joan Tisch Teaching Fellow at the Whitney Museum of American Art, she holds a PhD from Princeton University. Her doctoral dissertation is the first book-length study of sculptor Lee Bonteque's oeuvre during the most active period of her production, 1958 to 1971. Katz has taught art history courses at Occidental College, Pomona College, Pratt Institute, and UCLA, and has recently contributed to the catalogs Elizabeth Murray, Flying By, Doug Aitken, Electric Earth, Carrie James Marshall, Mastery, and Whitney Museum of American Art Handbook of the Collection. So welcome, Anna, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you for being such a gracious virtual host this week. I've really enjoyed my visits with the artists. Thank you also to Helen Molesworth, who extended this invitation some months ago, pre-COVID, and to Peter Wanders and the Board of Trustees at Anderson Ranch. If you're ready, I'm going to start sharing my screen. I can't talk and do that at the same time. I don't know what, I have too much performance anxiety, I suppose. Just give me 1 second while I figure that out.
No worries at all. We'll hang in there. It always takes a little extra time with Zoom to get that share up.
It is taking a little bit of time. Hold on. Okay, this is just taking a little bit longer than I anticipated, but let's do it this way. We're going to share my desktop. And now I hope you see my first slide. Okay.
Great.
All right. Okay. We're good, everyone. Okay. So my name is Anna. I am a curator at MoCA, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles. And last fall, October 2019, the museum opened an exhibition that I had been working on for some time. It's titled With Pleasure, Pattern and Decoration in American Art, 1972 to 1985. And today I'm going to tell you a little bit about that show and about the pattern and decoration movement and why I think that it is worthy of our attention today. So, the pattern and decoration movement has not been much studied. So if you've not heard of it, that's fine. You're in very good company. I was one of the people who hadn't heard of it up until not that long ago, all things considered. I can begin explaining a little bit about the pattern and decoration movement by saying that in 1975 in New York, a group of artists gathered in the loft of the painter Robert Sikanich. They gathered so that they could discuss a shared and recent tendency in their work. They were all overtly embracing decoration, ornament, and craft, forms of art that had long been considered inferior to so-called high or fine art. So Joyce Kozloff, whose diptych you see here, was making intricate paintings that used patterns from Morocco, Mexico, Turkey, and Spain, patterns that she saw in ceramic tile walls, in rugs, and other textiles. So Joyce was one of these artists. Tony Robin was using a modified spray gun to make these lyric abstractions, or these abstractions in these lyric colors, very much looking to, for example, Japanese decorative arts. Robert Sikanich was making very large scale, please note the size of these works, paintings of luscious blossoms in repeated patterns that were called, among other things, wallpaper. And Miriam Shapiro was combining bits of found materials, lace and printed fabrics that were associated with women's lives in these boisterous compositions. So they gathered together to, you might think that they gathered together in secret to sort of confess their trespass of one of the greatest prohibitions of modern art, the decorative. But in fact, I'm gonna go back, in fact, their art was exuberant, and so were they. They were like giddy with the thrill of destabilizing the entrenched hierarchies. In the first place, they knew that their work was going against the predilection, the preference, the long-standing preference for minimalism. And here I'm showing you two pictures from a famous exhibition at the Jewish Museum in 1966. And I once heard an art historian give a talk where he showed some pictures and said, I'm using these like a drunk uses a lamppost for support, not illumination. So I quote him now and just saying, I'm sort of using these as straw men, or as stand-ins anyway, for the cool, reductive, spare aesthetics of minimalism, which really were sort of apotheosis of the cool, reductive, spare aesthetics of modernism and its ambitions to purity, self-reflexivity, and autonomy. So locally, their work, they knew, was rather than minimalist, pointedly maximalist. But more broadly, they were overturning the longstanding hierarchy, again, of fine arts above decorative arts, which had been in place truly for hundreds of years in the Western art tradition. They were inspired by, they were motivated by 1970s social movements. They were looking a lot to feminist art historians and concluding that that hierarchy, which denigrated craft, decoration, and ornament, either on the basis of its femininity, as with domestic handicrafts like embroidery, or denigrated craft, decoration, and ornament on the basis of its primitivism, or its mere status as craft. We can think here about textiles, ceramics, and all kinds of traditional, often non-Western arts. These artists came together and understood that this hierarchy was based on arbitrary, though not random, criteria, and that it could be overturned. So we are looking here at Miriam Shapiro's Barcelona Fan from 1979. In this time, Miriam Shapiro was developing her concept of femage. And femage is a portmanteau that combines female and collage, or feminine and homage. She was taking bits of fabric material. So we're looking here at beaded material, beaded fabric, printed fabrics, floral printed fabrics, brocaded fabrics, all intricately arranged and laid out in a pattern that suggests a handheld fan, which is a token of femininity in cultures from Spain to Japan, and normally something that would be considered quite trivial. She's given it to us here at this heroic scale. It's 12 feet wide, a painting that insists on validating the traditional creative achievements of women working in the home. She wanted her femages to evoke the homemaker's habit of saving bits and scraps of fabric that could be repurposed for quilts or applique or valentines or scrapbooking. She said, the collages who came before her were men, and we can think of Picasso scavenging the city streets of Paris at night for chair caning and newspapers, and that she wanted to make a collage, or she wanted to make femages, her versions of collage, in which she would scavenge her city streets, which would be her attic, her basement, her mother's attic, her mother's basement. So quilting was incredibly important for pattern and decoration artists. They were artists who, like Miriam Shapiro and Al Loving, whose work you see here, artists who were trained in 60s schools of formalist abstraction and had therefore in those contexts been prohibited from like surface embellishment, all these things that would have been considered a degradation of serious formal abstraction. But quilting was really important to them because they understood that quilts were, well, traditionally made by women, usually anonymously and often collectively, and that quilts are a highly developed form of abstract art that anticipated the so-called invention of abstraction in painting by literally hundreds of years. And yet, of course, on the scale of human achievement, rarely do quilts rank above paintings. Like, we all know in our heart of hearts that even in the new MoMA, there is like a 0% chance that you're gonna walk in and see a big old quilt on the wall. But quilts were important for these artists because they understood, again, that when they were using the busy patterns, the rich textures, the dense compositions, the materials of quilts, they were not only suggesting new definitions of what counts as art, but new definitions of who can count as an artist. There are several types of categories of artists in this exhibition with pleasure. There are canonical art, canonical P&D artists like Miriam Shapiro, who is widely recognized as a founding member of the movement. There are also artists who we'll look at in a moment whose contributions to pattern and decoration have been under-recognized. Many of those are Los Angeles or West Coast artists. And then there's a class of artists in the exhibition, like Al Loving, whose 1975 work you see here on the left, who are not associated with pattern and decoration, and whose inclusion in the show does not represent like a curatorial bid to argue that Al Loving was really a pattern and decoration artist and that we should reconsider him, but artists whose work is in the show so that we can really kind of like punch out and find the edges of pattern and decoration in this period and see for how many artists in this time, a broad, rich range of artists, American artists in this time, pattern and decoration were aesthetic strategies. So Al Loving, like Miriam Shapiro, had been trained as an abstract painter and had received significant recognition as a painter of hard edge geometric abstraction. He was the first Black artist to receive a solo show at the Whitney Museum in the late 1960s. But in the late 1960s, he also came to feel a gap, a distance, I guess, between his work and his own identity as a Black man in America in the late 1960s, early 1970s, in the context of the civil rights movement, the rise of the movement for Black power. So he was feeling this distance between his earlier abstract paintings. He saw an exhibition of quilts. It stirred for him memories of his grandmother's quilting bee, of sitting underneath the quilt as it would be stretched across the laps of his grandmother and presumably her circle of women, sisters, neighbors, friends. It stirred for him these memories. He went home, he tore up his old canvases, the ones that he now regarded as dissociated with the concerns of Black life. He tore them up. He learned from his wife how to operate a Singer sewing machine, and he reassembled the fragments to make these unstretched paintings that hang like quilts. So as far as I know, a comparison has not been made between Al Loving and Miriam Shapiro in this context. But again, in this exhibition, we point to the many artists who in this period were rethinking what counts as art and understanding that the criteria were really theirs to redefine. Women's work was a major concern of pattern and decoration artists. On the right, I'm showing you Wedding Tower by Pat Lash, who was one of the early members of AIR Artists in Residence, the first non-cooperative, no, not non-cooperative, the first cooperative nonprofit women's gallery in New York that was founded in the early 1970s. Pat Lash's signature form at this time was a cake sculpture. She made these cake sculptures first by cutting paper, and then she piped acrylic paint through a cake pastry piping bag. And in these incredibly detailed marks, made garlands and rosettes, and then pierced the top layer of the cake with sewing needles, which are trailed with, and you can barely see it in this picture, gold thread. Pat wanted to pay homage to those skills, not that she learned in art school. She went to art school, she's got the degree, but to pay homage to those skills that she learned, that she inherited from her familial lineage. Her father was a pastry chef and her mother was a seamstress. She also, as you can, I think, see here, wanted to pay homage to those ways in which we mark the occasions of our everyday lives, birthdays and anniversaries and weddings. This is a work that might seem like silly and frilly and girly. It's, you know, about confectionery and its delights, but it's also about the ways that we use the tools that we have to like share our love with one another. There's a lot of excess in pattern and decoration. There is an extraordinary amount of detail, and detail had really for thousands of years in the Western literary and philosophic tradition been weaponized as insignificant and as feminine. These artists took on detail and took on the risk that their work would be considered not necessarily even controversial, but ignorable in its prettiness. This is a painting by Sandy Sallin, an LA-based artist who showed and who identified as a pattern decoration artist in the 1970s and 1980s. Here I'm showing you Howardina Pindel's Carnival at Ostend from 1977. Really hard to make out, of course, but what you're looking at here is a grid of canvas squares. You can see some of the lines here, like this would be one square, that have been sewn together. Howardina Pindel was in the 1970s a curator at MoMA, I believe one of the only Black curators at MoMA. She was in the department of, I think it was called Prints and Illustrated Books at that time. And she was traveling extensively in East and West Africa. She was traveling in Ivory Coast and Nigeria, many places. And she was inspired by the traditional textiles that she saw, like Nigerian strip weaving and kente cloth. She was inspired to take her paintings off the stretcher, to leave them unstretched. So indeed, this painting is unstretched. It is just tacked directly to the wall with nails at the top here. She was inspired to leave her paintings unstretched, to let them be fabric in the world. You know, I think that when you, I don't know what, see like a Velázquez or a Rembrandt, you're not really encouraged to consider that that painting, that the substrate of that painting is a woven fabric, and that that fabric is really not unlike the one that you slept underneath last night, or wear on your body now, or dried yourself off with after your shower this morning. But these are artists who wanted to bring their painting in closer relationship to those fabrics that are close to us, to those objects and materials that are close to us. Okay, so not only did Howardina Pindell take her painting off the stretcher, or leave it unstretched rather, and not only did she, and again, you'll just have to trust me here, cut up her canvas and then sew it back together in these squares that might recall something like quilting squares, she then covered the entire thing in a thick layer of a sort of pearlescent or opalescent paint. It looks white, but there's got some pink in it, and then sprinkled, as if, I mean, I don't think sprinkle is her word, but I'm trying to suggest the decorative here, sprinkled the whole surface densely in cut paper. These are dots, punched dots from a clerical hole punch. And I don't think there are good examples of it here, but there are also sequins and glitter and bits of thread. And when she first made these paintings, Pindell also sprayed them with perfume. So these are all things, all materials and processes and forms that we associate with kitsch and craft and girliness and excess, really. You know, what pattern and decoration artists understood was that modernism was an art of exclusion, of progressively stripping away everything that wasn't considered essential to the medium, everything that was considered inessential or unnecessary. And what these artists wanted to do was to make an art of inclusion, to make an art where you would like throw in everything but the kitchen sink. Again, sequins and glitter and paint and kente cloth, or references to kente cloth and references to quilting. They wanted to make an art not of minimalism, but of maximalism, that for these artists to say, well, that for these artists, the modernist dictum of less is more like would not and could not, in fact, work for them. For them to say more is more was as much an aesthetic principle as like a mandate for social and political inclusion. And just as a nod to that, I'm showing you here Joyce Kozloff's statement, her manifesto really, negating the negative, an answer to Ad Reinhardt's on negation, and on affirmation, a manifesto that she wrote in 1976 for the first self-organized, the first exhibition of the pattern and decoration artists. It was called 10 Approaches to the Decorative. It was at Alessandra Gallery in Soho in 1976 and was organized by one of the artists, Jane Kaufman. And you can see here that, and I would draw your attention above all to this section on affirmation, in which she suggests that instead of being pure and purist and puritanical and minimalist and post-minimalist and reductive and formalist and blank and tough and cool and cold and rational, I'm pointing as if you guys can see me touching the screen. That's crazy. Okay, instead, I'm doing it again. Instead, I'll use the cursor. Instead of being sterile and masculine and machine-made, that she's arguing for an art that is additive, that is subjective, romantic, imaginative, personal, eccentric, fussy, funny, junky, vulgar, mannerist, warm, more. Again, for me, this stands in really for the importance of insisting that more is more. I mentioned detail, and indeed the minor. It's a really important category for these artists. I'm showing you here on the right, D. Shapiro's Rotunda 1 from 1980 and an installation shot where you can see it here on the left. Shapiro made this work by affixing pastry tips to her tubes of paint. There are 3 artists in this exhibition. There are 45 artists in the exhibition, and 3 of them are using pastry tips. One of them is using cookie cutters. She was affixing pastry tips to her tubes of acrylic paint and then squeezing out these most minuscule lines so that she could make a grid that mimicked a woven surface. And she wanted to honor really the untold number of women past who had worked without recognition and without compensation to make the kinds of woven fabrics and baskets that her paintings allude to. I have a detail for you here. She also wanted to honor her grandmother, who was a Russian Jewish immigrant and textile factory worker turned labor activist, who taught her how to sew, knit, and embroider. On the right here, I'm showing you a drawing, a pencil drawing by Constance Malinson. You can see it depicted here. An LA-based artist who, like D. Shapiro, was interested in the tiniest, most minute gestures of the grid. She was using colored pencil to make patterns that evoke like jacquard and herringbone fabric in the case of this work here. You know, she's interested, like D. Shapiro, in those gestures that, well, that suggest like needlepoint arts, that suggests, you know, repetition, and that gives shape to women's lives historically. You know, when we think about greatness, we think about art, and we think about our history, we think about like great pyramidal compositions, right? Like, I don't know, Marcus Aurelius on his horse, right? Like we think about like men like going charging into battle and then like slaying something, like, and then go back home, take your, I don't know what, like women and your wine or whatever. But like generally speaking, women didn't really get those kinds of arcs. Like, generally speaking, a woman's life is like diaper, 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 dish, 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 fold, 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 pleat, pleat, pleat. So these are artists who are interested in the detail because it gives shape to needlepoint arts, which are associated and had been negatively associated with women's work and women's lives, but also give shape to the sort of minor and effaced position of women in art and in society at large. There's also an argument among pattern and decoration artists about the grid and about associating the grid with mosaic and basketry and the loom, and insisting in this way on sources of abstraction that are global, ancient, and decorative. Indeed, one of the essential bids of pattern and decoration was to say that abstraction was not invented like by Kandinsky in 1910, but that abstraction had roots that stretched the world over, were centuries old, and indeed that abstraction had been developed with great complexity in the decorative arts. Okay, so there's a lot of like grid and detail, but there's also a lot of color and pleasure and looseness and organic form in pattern and decoration. And here I'm showing you works by Brad Davis, Nancy Graves, and Robert Sikanich. This painting here is 21 feet wide. It's a triptych by Robert Sikanich called Angel Feet from 1978. It's in the collection of the Whitney Museum of American Art. And like many of the works in this exhibition, which come from museum collections, it has never been shown at the Whitney. Many of the works I'm saying that I borrowed from museums had never been shown by those museums. Fine. Angel Feet dates to 1978, and it's a stellar example of Sikanich's reference to his grandparents' home. He said that he was, well, he was raised by his grandparents who were Eastern European immigrants. And he was interested in ornament in the way that he knew and experienced it in the home of his grandparents, who decorated everything. He said that his grandparents refused to live in bleak, empty rooms, which I think is a pointed reference to the bleak, empty rooms of art museums, say, or of galleries at the time, that his grandparents refused to live in bleak, empty rooms, and they decorated everything. And I don't know who is in the audience right now. Like, all I see is Liz, but I'm assuming, whoever you are out there, I am assuming that your imagination is set off right now, that you can easily imagine embroidered pillows and tablecloths and hand stenciled wallpaper. And indeed, wallpaper is the sort of primary reference of Sikanich's paintings. Obviously, under normal circumstances, to compare a painting to wallpaper is like the worst insult you can hurl at it. But in the case of these artists, it is indeed like a term of praise. You know, what you might say, and what was said and is still said about this kind of work, or about this work specifically, is that pleasure and ornament and joy are like not serious. That pleasure and joy and ornament are not rigorous, high-minded, conceptual concerns. But, you know, I think what Robert Sikanich would have said, any of these, I mean, would have, he's still alive, but I think what these artists were saying through their work was that, like, yes, pleasure, joy, ornament may not be serious, but that doesn't mean that they're unimportant. In every culture that we know of, like across time, across place, we have added pattern and color to our dishes, to our blankets, to our clothes. There is no reason that I should be wearing this like ridiculous top right now. I could easily, Liz, you could easily be sitting here like in sackcloth, and you would be warm and you would be modest. But we do not do that. We paint our cups and we weave our blankets with color. In every culture across time and place, it must be that there is indeed something important. Maybe it's not serious. I don't really care about that. These artists didn't really either. But there must indeed be something important. There must be something about homemaking, about welcoming each other into our homes, about glorifying, ornamenting, and I think most of all, like humanizing the spaces and objects of our lives that decoration performs for us, again, across time and across place. I'm showing you here purple in the collection of the Nelson Atkins Museum. And on the right, a documentation of the artist Robert Kushner wearing purple for a performance from 1975. Robert Kushner was and remains deeply interested in textile arts and in fashion and in clothes. And in this period, he was organizing performances that took the shape of a fashion show, like of a catwalk. And these were at the Kitchen and Paula Cooper and Holly Solomon Gallery. For this performance called Persian Line in 1975, he made a series of garments that were loosely based on the chador, which is a cloak, a traditional cloak worn by Persian women. And for him, for Kushner, the opportunity of pattern and decoration was to like really take part in the sumptuous visual feast that the world had to offer. He said that he and the other artists were interested in everything that was excluded from Jansen's history of art, right? Everything decorative, everything non-Western. Now, 45 years later, I think we're better equipped to understand the problematic ways in which, in a case like this, the artist is appropriating the chador, taking it out of its context, severing it from its context, and exoticizing it in ways that I don't imagine most artists would undertake today. And this brings us to like a point in the talk where I want to speak a little bit about the complexities of the non-Western for these artists who were predominantly, though not exclusively, white. And here's some documentation from a Persian Line performance at the Kitchen in New York. On the right, I'm showing you here Mary Grigoriadis' Rain Dance from 1974. Mary was one of the founding members of AIR, Artists in Residence, that nonprofit women's cooperative that I mentioned earlier. Mary grew up in the Greek Orthodox Church, and she thought of her paintings as secular icons. She was fascinated with the iconostasis and with Byzantine icons. And what she sought to do with paintings like this was to find forms that would be associated equally with women's work. And she was looking to knitting patterns and embroidery patterns as like the ones that had decorated her home growing up. She was looking to make forms, as I say, that evoked women's work and as much as non-Western decorative art. So in a painting like Rain Dance, you might see Native American sand painting or Assyrian reliefs or Mayan temple facades, or maybe even Art Deco ornamentation. She was interested in the kind of common cause between women's work and non-Western art, because indeed women's work and non-Western art had both been denigrated as decorative, had both been dismissed in the, again, like Western philosophy and literature for thousands of years along the same terms, along the same lines. And indeed, many of these artists were interested in non-Western art because well, for two reasons. Because in many non-Western cultural traditions, there is no hierarchy of art and craft. There is often not even a distinction between art and craft. And the association between women's work or between femininity and decoration is largely a Western cultural construction. So for these artists to look from the vantage point of non-Western art was indeed like a way to rethink the terms of the hierarchy and to rethink its negative associations. Now, here again, I think we can take a moment to understand that this was, in the case of Mary Grigoriadis, like an unequal exchange. It wasn't the case, as far as I know, that at this time Native American artists were also looking to white women's work and saying like, hey, we have common cause, that this was indeed a sort of one-way appropriation and not an exchange. And that the one way of this direction reiterated larger systemic imbalances of power. I think that for these artists, the critique of the museum was really focused on the critique of the museum as an institution that instituted a hierarchy of art and craft, and not a critique of the museum as an institution that was colonialist and imperialist in its DNA. So I'm showing you here, I'm showing you here on the right an installation shot. Looks a little out of focus, doesn't it? But never mind. I'm showing you here an installation shot. And on the left, one of Faith Ringgold's Windows of the Wedding. Faith Ringgold is, of course, preeminent, widely celebrated African-American artist who in 1972 visited the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam for the first time. Well, she visited the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam in 1972, and for the first time, she saw Tibetan tankas, which are religious scroll paintings, usually with a brocaded border. And, you know, like for many artists, one of her realizations had to do with how she could solve problems of transportation and storage. But she was inspired by the Tibetan tanka because it offered her a way to think about painting outside of easel painting. It offered her a way to think about how to make a painting that would indeed sort of pose a challenge to the white male authority of easel painting. So she used fabrics here, some of which were imported African fabrics. You can't really make it out here in this slightly fuzzy slide, but she was also using like upholstery fabric. She used quilting techniques to make these borders. And in fact, she employed the assistance of her mother, who was an accomplished seamstress. And the center panels of the paintings, which are indeed acrylic on canvas, are geometric patterns that were drawn from African Kuba cloth patterns. So what she said she wanted to do was to translate the Tibetan tanka into a unique African American expression. Here too, I think that we can bring some criticism to bear. I don't think that at the time, Ringgold was maybe sufficiently considering the context in which she encountered the Tibetan tanka in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam in 1972, and understanding, maybe she understood, but her work was not offering a critical view of those dynamics by which the Western Art Museum collected art from around the world. We know it wasn't collecting, we know it was theft, to present patterns, decoration as like a storehouse of styles. I'm just gonna look at my watch. I'm sorry, Takako, I'm gonna skip your painting. We love you, Takako. The last sort of type of work that I want to talk about is installation art. One of the lasting influences of pattern and decoration, I believe, is its contribution to the development of installation art. For Joyce Kozloff, the move was to stop making paintings, which she understood, or which she came to understand because of criticisms that she received from her friends in the like ceramics art world and the fiber art world. She came to understand that her paintings, her previous paintings, were simply like using low art sources for high art purposes. And in 1979, she actually set about to decorate a room. So she made these ceramic tile pilasters. Pilasters are columns that have no architectural, support function. She made them, you can barely see, but she went to Dean and DeLuca in Soho to get cookie cutters and rolling pins to make these luster glazed ceramic tile pilasters. And then at the Fabric Workshop in Philadelphia, she printed these silks. And all of these patterns are copied from the Alhambra in Spain, and from books about Seljuk ceramics, and from Native American indigenous patterns. They're all, it's a sort of encyclopedia of global patterns. Again, the idea here was that she wanted to actually decorate a room. And indeed, after she made this installation called An Interior Decorated in 1979, Joyce Kozloff stopped making private art paintings and committed herself to making public art for the next 20 some years. For her conviction was that to really make good on the promise of decoration, she needed to decorate the spaces of everyday life. Most people are not going to come into a contemporary art museum, but most people are going to ride the subway. And when they do, their journey through the turnstile is going to be made that much more humane by a piece of public art. Okay, I'm also going to skip over Kim McConnell. I love you, Kim. And I'm show you just two more pieces. I don't think I'm gonna be able to do it in 1 minute, but we'll give it a shot. You're looking here at a wallpaper installation by Cynthia Carlson. She began making these wallpaper installations in the mid 1970s, and for our exhibition, Cynthia came on site. We painted the walls in this green and red gradient, and then she affixed to the walls in regular intervals, these flower forms. So you can't really see this well. I'll show you a little bit more of a detail, but this is acrylic paint, like mixed with some kind of medium that she squeezed through a cake pastry piping bag. She's another of the pastry piping bag artists in this show. And they're these sort of like hard rubbery things. Like you could pick one of these flowers up by the tip and shake it around and it would blah, 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 blah. She affixes them to the wall and then draws in these shadows. I'm showing you the installation that we were recreating here on the right. You know, for Cynthia, again, wallpaper was an important source and, in this case, form for her, because indeed wallpaper is normally something that we would overlook. It's wallpaper fits the wall that's already given, and that's kind of the principle, in fact, of decoration. Like the canvas painting on the easel is its own raison d'etre, but decoration is squeezed into a pre-given surface, right? It's decoration is where someone says, like, to someone, like, you get that corner over there, make it pretty. And they're like, okay, and they do. And such is the case with wallpaper. And the last two things that I want to say are about the wallpaper and like the joy of this work. And the open-heartedness of this work. There are, as I mentioned, 45 artists in this exhibition, and many of them are not traditionally associated with pattern and decoration. So once I had decided as a curator that that the show was going to crack pattern and decoration open and out in this period, then really like all kinds of art were on the table for consideration. And so I had to invent not from thin air, from study and research, but I had to invent some criteria. And my criteria were actually really subjective. I mean, within, again, like the historical research. But ultimately, I only included work in the show that I felt was sincere, not ironic, and warm rather than cool. And that is a huge part of what I admire about these artists. And I didn't do this show because I liked this art. I did this show because there had not been a large-scale historical survey that adequately considered pattern and decoration. I approached this as a scholar, as an art historian, but what happens, of course, is that you come to care for your art and your artists dearly. And what I really came to admire was how uncool these artists are, how much they like really put themselves out there and like really put their heart on their sleeve. So that's one last thing I want to say. And the second last thing I want to say is about this work here. And this is just, I mean, it's almost ridiculous that I'm even showing you this installation shot of this video monitor that has this still that, like, you have no idea what this is. So I'm just gonna have to describe it. This video is by an artist named Tina Gerard, who died last year. It's called Maintenance 3. It dates from 1973. And in this video, just super lo-fi, we see sort of like the lap of the artist, or like we're kind of looking closely anyway. And what she's doing is maintaining a set of fabrics that were given to her by her uncle, like floral printed silk fabrics. She's maintaining them. It's 5 things, and I really hope I can remember them all. She is sewing them, washing them, rinsing them, wringing them, and folding them. And she's doing this, so here, this is like sudsy water. Here her hands are like rinsing them in the water. And while she's doing this, there is, the radio is playing, like, you know, top 40 radio. So it's like Sly and the Family Stone and the Beatles and Dark Side of the Moon. And then also, because it's the radio, it's like, and the video is like 20 something minutes long, like someone, like a radio guy, you know, comes on, is like, come to the like blah, blah, blah club on Route 95 this Saturday night, midnight, you know. And because it's 1973, someone also comes in and it's like, an update on the Watergate hearings. The Watergate hearings were the United States Senate's investigation into the illegal and unethical activities related to the 1972 presidential election campaign that ultimately resulted in President Nixon's resignation in 1974. And for me, this is a good place to end, and a good reminder of what these artists felt was at stake. That Tina Gerard's video, which pays attention to like daily domestic activities and floral printed fabrics, you're just gonna have to believe me on that one, sets out to tether her interest in daily domestic activities and floral printed fabrics to politics at a much larger scale. That these were artists who understood keenly that authority of all kinds needed to be challenged in every sphere, from art history to those who were in fact not serving the interests of the greater good. So thank you all very much for your attention. I look forward to your questions. I'm going to stop sharing.
Okay, thank you so much, Anna. That was
You're welcome, Liz.
incredibly fascinating. And if you saw me looking down, it's because I was taking notes. I couldn't help it.
Good.
I was very interested in a lot of the concepts that you brought up that I knew nothing about, and I find really interesting the philosophies of this movement. So I will pose our first question, which is, so how were men who participated in the pattern and decoration movement at the time perceived? Were they more validated because they were men, or were they criticized for participating in feminine image making?
Yes, the answer is yes. Yeah. Okay, there are a couple ways to come at this question. One has to do with the artist's intentions and their own relationship to feminism. Some of them were indeed self-identified as feminists, whether or not they were identified as feminists. And in this exhibition, about a third of the artists are men. Whether or not they were identified as feminists, my argument is that feminist art history, that the methods of feminist art history were changing the terms, that the methods of feminist art history, and like these artists were friends with, Linda Nochlin, right? Like that they understood that the definition of art had been gerrymandered to exclude everything that was not white and not male. And again, they understood that this was an arbitrary designation and that all it really took was a change in mindset for them to overturn it. So again, regardless of the artist's own relationship to the women's movement or to feminism as a philosophy, a political movement, my argument is that they were deploying feminist art historical methods to reconsider the ways in which the categorization, the hierarchy of fine art above decorative art consigns us to dismissing the historical creative achievements of women and non-Western artists the world over. Okay, that's one part of it. The other part of it is, yes, like commercially, it is no surprise that the male artists did the best. I don't know what to say about that. Like,
yeah. Well, that's
I don't know what to say about the market.
Art history, like that's the theme.
Yeah, I do not know what to say about the art market. It like perplexes me, and it is it's what can I tell you, Liz?
Okay, well, thank you. No, that was enlightening. Yeah. So another question is about pleasure and joy. It's interesting that pleasure and joy were seen as not rigorous. Now with the pandemic, it seems that we embrace simple pleasures and joy and daily ritual and mundane tasks as important. what do you see as a prediction for the art that might come out of this in connection with the pattern and decoration?
Yeah, I mean, when I began working on this exhibition, I was motivated in large part by what I saw happening in young artist studios, by an embrace of decoration, ornament, and craft that I was seeing in young artist studios. And I think that, the easiest thing to point to here would be like the meteoric rise of ceramics in recent years. And so my motivation really was to like make sense of that, because what I was surmising was that pattern and decoration had this influence that had not been adequately assessed. It hadn't had the opportunity really even to see the work. And I also went in making it under a presidency in which I don't even want to say the man's name anymore, right? But like, in which I was motivated to like go back to the feminist playbook, right? To like open it back up and be like, we've been here before, haven't we? Like, how did those who came before us do it? And how can we take the opportunity to make that, how did those who come before us do it? And again, like my conclusion had a lot to do with pleasure and joy, the pleasure that they that these artists took in like lifting the sanction against the decorative. I think that's a lot of what we're seeing in this work, like the joy that they must have experienced in lifting this sanction and like delving into the vastness and complexity of art, which they had been discouraged from like taking seriously in any way. And that indeed, as I was wanting to say a little bit about Cynthia Carlson, sort of wearing your heart on your sleeve and making work that is sincere and warm in its affect, that their goal was to like give that pleasure back, to invite us to take equal pleasure. In the case of the pandemic, what I'm interested to see, this exhibition is traveling in 2 months to the Hessel Museum at Bard College in upstate New York, Annandale on Hudson. And what I'm curious to see is whether indeed it will feel like a tonic, whether it will indeed be even more welcome than it was 2 falls ago. But for me, I won't know the answer to this person's question until I see it on the wall again.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. It'll be really interesting to see. Okay, so I guess we have time for one more, and there are a couple of people kind of asking a version of the same question, which is sort of what work are you seeing, what current artists are taking from the pattern and decoration movement and taking it to another level? Where do we see it cropping up as something that other artists, younger artists, are embracing?
I'm a little reluctant, I have to say, to like name names, just because I don't want to narrow the scope of what I think the influence of pattern and decoration might be, but but I think we see it in paintings by, I'm thinking of LA artists who are like, close to home for me, like Diana Molzon or Rebecca Morris. I think we see it in Laura Owens, but more broadly, more than that, I think that we see a broad range of artists for whom the decorative is indeed a kind of cipher for and a term by which to place their own marginalization or the marginalization, historically speaking, of their work. So I'm thinking, again, like of LA artists who feel close to home for me, like Diedrich Brackens, who works in weaving and who indeed came and gave a talk about our work. or not close to home in New York, Sanford Biggers, who studied with Joyce Kozloff at Skowhegan and also came and gave a talk about our show. I think that it's what I really think that we can point to is the ways in which the secondary status of the decorative has come to be associated with a kind of identitarian politics in contemporary art quite broadly. And that is not only owing to pattern and decoration, but I don't think that we can fully understand that without taking a look at pattern and decoration.
Wow. Yeah, that makes sense. Well, thank you. Thank you for answering some questions. So there are a few more, but I think we're going to have to stop. Unfortunately, we really appreciate that. That was really incredible. Thank you for your time and for sharing with us your research and your wonderful show. That sounds amazing. And hopefully people will get a chance to go see it. I also want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. And I wanted to mention that next week on Thursday at 4 p.m. Mountain Time, you should join us for our virtual open studios with our current artists in residence. They're going to do a sort of what I made at Anderson Ranch talk, and they'll each get a chance to kind of show some of the work they've made while they're here. We're excited about that. And again, Anna, I just want to send out a big thank you. Thank you for being a critic for our residents. I know they're very excited, and some of them you haven't even met yet. We're going to be conducting a few more visits. So we really appreciate you as being part of our community this week and for sharing with us. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you for having me, and thank you to Anderson Ranch.
All right. Good night.
Take care. Goodbye.